Financing for results in Zimbabwe. In this course, we have learned a lot about finance for development, and indeed, finance is an important cog in the new development agenda, the SDGs 2016 to 2030. Without adequate finance, surely achievement of the SDGs remains in serious danger, particularly for many of the low-income countries whose capacity to mobilize resources is weak. I will talk about Zimbabwe. For the past 5 years, the country's budget has remained at a low of 4 billion, and of that 4 billion, 92% of the resources are spent on current expenditures, of which employment costs account for 80%. Capital budgets are consuming just the remainder of about 8%. And also the country is implementing an equally ambitious blueprint known as the Zimbabwe Agenda for Sustainable Socio-Economic Transformation, ZIMASET, whose funding requirements are estimated at 33.2 billion over 5 years, of which budgeted resources can only do 3.5 billion, leaving a projected funding gap of 27.9 billion. So the issue of financing cannot be overemphasized, let alone when we talk about the SDGs, whose funding requirements are huge. And so I've developed the three wheels that I think are critical in enhancing financing for development. The first one is domestic resource mobilization, followed by efficiency in public spending, then official development assistance. And these wheels are anchored by strong wind that is sound macroeconomic policies and political stability. We should be able to blow and turn these wheels to create a fiscal space for increased social and capital spending. At the end of the day, the outcome should be the attainment of SDGs and the achievement of ZIMASET targets. So the first wheel is domestic resource mobilization. We know that tax to GDP ratios in many developing countries are below 20%, but for Zimbabwe, that ratio has been above 27%, which shows limited scope in as far as tax policy is concerned. So we also know that domestic resource mobilization is expected to contribute 50% to 80% of resources to finance development. So the question is, how can domestic resources be enhanced? I've come up with a couple of points that the Minister of Finance need to take note of. That is one, developing the domestic debt market, which has been dormant since 2008. As well as pension funds, private investment. So these are instruments that can enhance domestic resource mobilization. The second wheel is efficiency in public spending. Efficiency in public spending is all about conversion of all the resources into development results on the ground. What really matters is doing the right thing and doing it well. So there is need to address both the allocative and technical or productive aspects in public spending. Key to this is the need to deal with the 3 C's, that is capacity problems within the public spending system, the issue around capture, whereby narrow interests are taking much of the resources. I've already spoken about employment costs taking 80% of the budget, and most importantly, issues around corruption, particularly in the public procurement systems, taking much of the resources out of the system that could be used to produce results on the ground. Also, there is need for better prioritization. For example, 38 million 38 million in resources were spent on foreign travel alone between January and September 2015, compared to 5 million that was spent on non-wage spending in education. So issues of better prioritization can actually result in better outcomes. Another important point is then to look at the wage bill reforms and reduce the share of employment costs from the high of 80% to below 40%, which is comparable to other developing countries. And also of importance is the issue of reforming the state-owned enterprises, which have remained a drain on the fiscals. They are perennial loss makers, and they rely on fiscal support. Yet these are resources that could be better channeled for development purposes. The third and final wheel is the wheel of official development assistance. Currently, ODA levels average around 6% of GDP or 21% of revenues, and has played a great role in supporting non-wage spending in social sectors in upwards of around 80%, since most of the budget is spent on employment costs. The burden of non-wage has been on development assistance. So beyond supporting social sectors, there is need to use ODA as a catalytic tool to crowd in domestic resource mobilization by helping creating an environment where private sector growth is directly benefits poor people, or responding to climate change, and enforcing zero tolerance on policy on customs, as we have learned from the Georgian example, and also supporting studies to unpack illicit financial flows and reduce revenue loss to such leakages. Also, the concessionality of ODA can actually help in enhancing debt sustainability, given that the country is already facing a debt burden of about 8.4 billion, which is about 60% of GDP, against sustainable thresholds of 30% for low-income countries. So, turning these three wheels will surely enhance fiscal space for increased social infrastructure spending for the achievement of the